pacemaker disconnected at 2:28 in the morning, not because the battery failed, not because Nancy had a cardiac episode in the middle of the night, not because of any medical explanation that her doctors would later point to in a chart. The device disconnected from its remote monitoring service at 2:28 in the morning because something happened at that precise moment that either removed Nancy from any environment where a signal could transmit, or because someone or something interfered directly with the device itself. And when you place that timestamp against the full sequence of events that preceded it, when you line it up against the camera going dark at 1:47, against the motion sensor alert at 2:12, against the vehicle captured 2.5 miles away at 2:36, a picture assembles itself that is more methodical, more deliberate, and more disturbing than anything the initial reporting suggested. This case was never random. It was never opportunistic. According to multiple former federal agents with decades of combined experience working violent crimes and kidnapping operations, what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st, 2026, was the product of weeks of planning, inside intelligence, and a coordinated operation involving more than one person, each with a specific role to play. And the person millions of people watched on that doorbell camera footage, the one in the ski mask that became the center of almost every analysis, almost every theory, almost every headline for 6 straight weeks, may not have been the person who actually took Nancy at all. This is the crime files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the pursuit of truth. Before we go any further, there is something that needs to be stated clearly and unambiguously at the outset of this investigation. Everything discussed in this video is drawn from publicly available information, from investigative reporting by credible news organizations, and from professional analysis provided by former law enforcement personnel who have worked cases that parallel this one. No individual has been charged in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Every person referenced in this analysis is presumed innocent under the law. The theories we examine are interpretations of available evidence, not accusations, and not established facts. If you have information about Nancy's disappearance, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. There is currently a reward of $1.2 million for information that leads to her safe return. Please use it. Now let us talk about Nancy Guthrie, because to understand what happened to her, you first need to understand who she is and why the details of her life matter to this investigation. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the co-host of NBC's Today Show. She is also the mother of Annie, who lives in Tucson. She is a grandmother. She is a neighbor who, by every account from the people who knew her on Camino Real in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, was one of those rare people who make a street feel like a community rather than just a collection of houses. She waved at people walking their dogs. She knew the names of the families on both sides of her. She sent Christmas cards every December without fail. She was present in the way that most people aspire to be and never quite manage. She has a pacemaker. This is not a peripheral detail. It is central to every dimension of this case. Her family has been transparent about the fact that her health requires ongoing medical management. She takes specific medications on a specific schedule. She undergoes regular monitoring that tracks her cardiac function and allows her physicians to intervene if something goes wrong. The pacemaker itself transmits data continuously to a remote monitoring service, which means that at any given moment, her doctors have access to real-time information about how her heart is functioning. Being separated from that system, from those medications, from that oversight, for any sustained period is not merely an inconvenience for an 84-year-old woman with cardiovascular vulnerabilities. It is a genuine, escalating, day-by-day medical crisis. When Nancy's family speaks about urgency, this is what they mean, not just the terror of not knowing, the concrete biological reality that every passing day without medical care compounds the risk to her life in ways that are both measurable and irreversible. She has lived in the Catalina foothills for years. The neighborhood sits in the northern part of Tucson, where the city begins to give way to the Santa Catalina Mountains. It is an established residential area with mature landscaping and the kind of quiet that people who move there are specifically seeking. Homes are set back from the street. Properties are maintained. Neighbors tend to know one another over time rather than through brief introductions at the mailbox. It is the kind of place where an 84-year-old woman living alone would be visible enough that her neighbors would notice if something seemed wrong, but private enough that an operation carried out in the early hours of a February morning could complete itself before anyone had reason to look outside. The house on Camino Real had security measures. A Nest doorbell camera at the front entrance, a heavy reinforced metal security gate across the front door that neighbors describe as the kind of barrier you see in high-security installations, additional cameras positioned around the property, a pacemaker linked to a monitoring service that logged her location and cardiac status continuously. From a certain angle, it was a well-protected home. From another angle, as the events of February 1st would demonstrate, it had vulnerabilities that someone had spent weeks identifying and planning around. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy did something she had done many times before. She went to her daughter Annie's house for dinner. They spent time together. They ate. They talked. It was unremarkable in every way that family evenings are unremarkable until something happens to make you realize how precious the ordinary ones actually are. At some point that evening, Nancy said goodnight to Annie and returned to her house on Camino Real. At 9:50 in the evening, surveillance cameras captured the image of Nancy's garage door closing behind her. She was inside. She was safe. She was almost certainly going through the routine that 84-year-old women who live alone develop over years. The small domestic sequence of checking the locks, taking the evening medications, maybe watching something on television before bed, the quiet rhythm of a life that was hers and that no one had any right to interrupt. She had no idea that in less than 4 hours, people who had been watching her, studying her, cataloging the details of her home and her habits for weeks, were going to come for her. At 1:32 in the morning on February 1st, 2026, the Nest doorbell camera at the front of Nancy's house activated. A male figure appeared on the porch. He was wearing a ski mask that covered his face completely. No skin visible. No identifying features accessible to the camera. He had on thick gloves, the kind that could be either heavy-duty work gloves or medical examination style, though the distinction would become relevant to the analysis of his tactical choices. He was carrying a backpack that was visibly full, noticeably packed with something before he ever arrived at that house, and positioned at the front of his waist, in a carry location that any trained firearms instructor would immediately identify as tactically problematic, was what appeared to be a holstered weapon. Over the next 15 minutes, from 1:32 until 1:47 in the morning, this individual moved around Nancy's front porch in a manner that looked to the millions of people who would subsequently analyze every available frame of the footage, like confusion, like amateur hesitation, like someone who had a plan that wasn't cooperating with reality. He approached the camera. He stepped back. He moved toward the door and then away again. He held up what appeared to be a branch or piece of foliage directly in front of the lens, as though trying to obscure the recording without fully committing to physically destroying the camera. His movements were not smooth. His body language conveyed something that most observers interpreted as uncertainty, as nervousness, as the specific kind of agitated energy that belongs to someone who is trying to commit a crime they haven't fully thought through. For 6 weeks, this 15-minute sequence was the centerpiece of public analysis. Behavioral analysts studied how he walked. Technical specialists examined his attempts to interact with the camera hardware. People on every platform with access to the footage went through it frame by frame, looking for anything identifiable. A tattoo on exposed skin, a brand name on the backpack, a distinctive item of clothing underneath the mask. The footage was enhanced, cropped, brightened, slowed down, reversed. It became one of those cultural moments where collective attention produces an enormous amount of noise and not very much signal. And most of that analysis was focused on the wrong question. Because the right question is not what was that person trying to do at the front door. The right question is whether the front door was ever his assignment at all. Jennifer Coffin-Dafter spent 25 years as an FBI special agent working kidnapping cases and violent crimes across the United States. She has investigated operations where the outcome for a living victim depended on decisions made in real time with incomplete information. She knows what physical evidence communicates about how a crime was designed versus how it actually unfolded. She has read crime scenes the way other people read text, extracting meaning from what is present and equally from what is conspicuously absent. When she turned her attention to the Nancy Guthrie case, she did not begin with the doorbell footage. She began with what investigators did after Nancy disappeared. Specifically, she looked at which locks were changed and where. Investigators changed the locks on the back of Nancy's house. For most people, this registers as a routine security precaution. Of course, you secure the property after a kidnapping. Of course, you change the locks. But Coffin-Dafter's analysis cuts through that assumption immediately. Law enforcement does not randomly change every possible lock on a victim's property as a general precaution. They do not have the time or the resources for that kind of unfocused security theater. They change specific locks on specific entry points when they have specific reasons to believe those entry points were used, or when they have reason to believe that someone who should no longer have access to a particular lock may still possess a key for it. The back of the house, not the front entrance where all the camera activity occurred, not the side windows or the garage door facing the street, the rear of the property. That decision, communicated through action rather than press release, tells a trained investigator something precise about where the FBI believes entry was actually made that night. Coffin-Dafter articulated her analysis with the directness of someone who has spent a career translating evidence into operational conclusions. Entry was made from the back, through or near the garage, into the home. The person visible on the doorbell camera was not attempting to enter through the front door. That was never his role. His role was to disable the front-facing surveillance camera and to create the visual appearance of a front entry attempt, drawing any potential attention toward the front of the house, while a second operative, working in coordinated parallel, made actual entry from the rear, where no camera recorded and no visibility from the street existed. Consider what this interpretation does to every specific behavior that puzzled analysts for 6 weeks. The 15 minutes of movement on the porch, when a genuine forced entry attempt takes minutes at most. That was not hesitation or confusion. That was a man executing his assignment precisely as designed. Stay visible at the front. Keep any potential observer focused on the front of the house. Run down the clock while your partner moves into position and makes entry from the back, the holding of foliage toward the camera lens. Not a panicked, improvised attempt to hide something unexpected. A deliberate effort to obscure the recording without triggering an immediate alert, maintaining the appearance of activity at the front while buying time for the coordination to complete. The uncertain, almost theatrical quality of his movements. Not amateur nervousness, the specific behavioral signature of someone who is performing, someone who is waiting for a cue, someone who has a defined role in a larger operation and is doing exactly what that role requires. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera went dark, the video feed stopped, and according to Coffin-Dafter's reading of the timeline, that was not a random technical failure or a lucky accident of timing. That was the signal. The moment at which the operative at the front door had completed his assigned task. The moment at which the person who had entered from the back had reached the point in the operation where eliminating the remaining surveillance became necessary. 25 minutes passed. At 2:12 in the morning, the Nest System's internal motion sensor logged an activation event. No video. The recording was disabled, but the hardware's sensors detected movement near the front door. Someone was still present, still active at the location. What they were doing in those 25 minutes between the camera going dark and that motion alert, whether the front door operative had entered the home to assist his partner, whether he remained outside maintaining a perimeter, whether something unexpected was being managed, cannot be determined from public information. But his presence at or near that location at 2:12 tells us the operation was still in progress. At 2:28, Nancy's pacemaker disconnected from its remote monitoring service. The device transmits continuously as long as it remains within range of either a Wi-Fi network or a cellular signal. Nancy's home had both. The coverage at her address would allow the pacemaker to transmit from anywhere inside the house and from the immediate surrounding property. For the signal to drop at 2:28, one of two things happened. Either the device itself was physically damaged or interfered with in a way that disrupted its transmission capability, or Nancy was moved beyond the range of any available signal, which in a residential neighborhood with substantial cellular infrastructure means she was being transported in a vehicle, moving away from the last connected location at a speed and in a direction that took her beyond coverage range within those specific minutes. At 2:36, surveillance cameras captured a vehicle traveling through a residential street approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's house on Camino Real. 8 minutes. From the moment Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting to the moment that vehicle appears on camera 2.5 miles away, 8 minutes elapsed. Think about what 8 minutes actually means in that context. You have to move an 84-year-old woman from inside a house, through whichever exit route was used, into a waiting vehicle. You have to close whatever was open. You have to drive 2.5 miles through residential streets in the middle of the night, where traffic laws and speed limits are not suggestions, but the boundary between executing your plan and attracting a police response that ends everything. You have to arrive at that second camera location and be visible in the frame. 8 minutes. The compression of that timeline suggests people who knew exactly where they were going before they left and were moving with every ounce of speed they could manage without triggering attention. There was no hesitation, no confusion about the route, no consultation about which direction to take. The exit was planned as precisely as the entry. When family members attempted to reach Nancy by phone later that morning and received no response, they contacted law enforcement. Investigators responded to the house on Camino Real and made a series of discoveries that would define the forensic architecture of this case. Blood was present on the front porch near the door. DNA analysis would subsequently confirm it was Nancy's blood. The quantity has not been made public by investigators. The characterization of whether it represented a minor injury or something more serious has also been withheld from public disclosure. But the presence of any biological material at a crime scene is not a neutral data point. Blood at the front porch of a kidnapping victim's home means there was a physical encounter, a struggle, an injury that the suspects either did not plan for or could not prevent. It means Nancy did not simply walk out of her house. It means she resisted. And here is what investigators did not find. No damage to the front door frame, no scratches on the lock hardware, no pry marks, no evidence of tools applied to the mechanism. No indication that anyone had attempted to force their way through the front entrance at any point during that night. The reinforced metal security gate that Nancy had installed across her front door, which neighbors describe as the kind of barrier that requires specialized equipment and significant time to defeat, and which would produce noise sufficient to alert anyone within earshot, was completely undamaged. No dents, no deformation, no evidence of any attempt to apply force to it at all. The front door was never touched. This is consistent with everything Coffin Dafter's analysis proposes. The people who took Nancy that night knew before they arrived that the front door was not a viable entry point. They knew because someone had given them that information, someone who had been on the property, someone who had seen that gate, someone who understood, from direct personal observation, that forcing the front entrance was not possible without equipment and noise that would have ended the operation before it began. They went to the back because they knew the back was the approach that worked. Now let us examine the backpack, because this single piece of evidence, analyzed by a former FBI hostage negotiator with years of experience inside the psychology of criminal operations, reveals something fundamental about the nature and intent of this crime. Chip Massey spent his FBI career in rooms with kidnappers, not analyzing kidnapping cases from a distance, but sitting across from people who had taken human beings and were deciding in real time whether to release them or not. He understands criminal thinking not as an academic exercise, but as a survival skill he applied in the most high-pressure circumstances imaginable. When he examined the doorbell footage, the element that arrested his attention was not the ski mask or the weapon or the gate behavior. It was that the backpack was full when the suspect arrived. Massey's explanation of why this matters is as precise as anything in this investigation. When a person intends to commit a robbery, they bring empty bags. They don't know in advance exactly what they are going to find, so they bring capacity. They bring the ability to carry whatever turns out to have value. The backpack they arrive with has space in it, because the point of the bag is to fill it with something at the target location. This suspect's backpack was already full before he reached Nancy's front door. Whatever was in that bag, it was chosen, packed, and carried from a starting point to Camino Real as equipment for a specific purpose, not for collecting, for executing. Based on the nature of the operation, Massey suggests the contents were most likely technical in character. Tools for physically interfering with camera systems, screwdrivers, wire cutters, devices capable of disrupting wireless transmission, possibly walkie-talkies or other communication equipment that allowed him to stay in contact with his partner without generating cellular records that would appear in a subsequent investigation. Backup equipment in case the primary method of camera defeat encountered an obstacle. Everything this person needed for the single, limited role he had been assigned that night. Defeat the surveillance, create the visual distraction, maintain the performance until the operation was complete. The full backpack tells us something that is as unambiguous as anything in the forensic record. This was never a robbery. The thought of stealing Nancy's jewelry or cash or valuables was never part of the planning for this operation. Every piece of equipment those suspects brought to Camino Real that night was selected for a single purpose: taking Nancy herself. She was the target from the first moment of the first planning conversation, and everything that followed, the reconnaissance, the coordination, the surveillance defeat, the divided roles, was built around that single objective. Now set this understanding of the operation's sophistication alongside what the same experts noted about its execution, because the contrast produces the central paradox of this case. The suspect's attempt to disguise his gait was theatrical in a way that a trained professional would never permit themselves. When he moved into the camera's focal range, his posture changed. He hunched. His arms dropped to his sides in an exaggerated way. He altered his movement in the manner of someone who had seen this technique in a film and was performing an impression of it rather than applying an actual learned methodology. Gait disguise is real. People who are concerned about being recognized by someone who knows their normal movement patterns do alter the way they walk. But a trained operative makes the alteration subtle and natural, adopting a different but believable presentation. This suspect's version was forced enough that it immediately communicated to Massey that the person executing it had no formal training in the technique. The gloves were incompatible with the weapon in a way that revealed either complete indifference to operational effectiveness or simple ignorance of basic firearms handling. Thick gloves that eliminate finger sensitivity make it impossible to manipulate a trigger with the fine motor control that firearm use actually requires. They make it impossible to feel safety mechanisms, to manage the pressure differential between a trigger at rest and a trigger in motion, to clear a malfunction quickly under stress. Massey was direct. Those gloves and that weapon do not work together. He would not be able to operate that firearm with any meaningful competence, which means either the weapon was a prop, present purely for the intimidation value it might provide if something unexpected occurred, or the person carrying it simply had not thought through the basic physical incompatibility between his equipment choices. The carry position was wrong in a way that suggests no formal training in weapon retention. The front of the waist is accessible to anyone standing in front of the carrier. It is slow to draw under real pressure. It violates every foundational principle taught in any serious tactical training program. Massey noted it almost in passing, as though the observation was too elementary to require extended explanation. He positioned that weapon in a way that made it available to anyone who decided to take it from it. These are not the errors of someone who has been trained. They are the errors of someone who assembled a crime costume based on a generalized media-derived idea of what a criminal should look like, without any grounding in the actual operational reality of what they were attempting. And then there is the 41 minutes. Professional kidnapping operations are measured in under 10 minutes from initial entry to departure with the target. The reason is simple mathematics. Every additional minute spent on scene after entry multiplies the risk of discovery. A neighbor hears something. An alarm company makes a phone call. A passerby notices a vehicle that doesn't belong. The victim escapes or creates noise sufficient to attract attention. Something goes wrong that could not have been anticipated. Discipline in professional extraction operations means minimizing time on target because time is the enemy of successful completion. From 1:47, when the doorbell camera went dark, until 2:28, when Nancy's pacemaker signal dropped, 41 minutes elapsed inside that house. Massey's assessment is unsparing. This is not a professional takedown. This is somebody who does not know how to handle the situation in front of them. What was happening during those 41 minutes? The forensic evidence provides the clearest available answer. Nancy woke up. She became aware that someone was in her home, and she fought. An 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and documented cardiovascular vulnerabilities, confronted in the middle of the night by masked intruders who had entered her home without her knowledge or consent, fought back with enough force and enough sustained resistance to cause physical injury to herself or one of her assailants, to leave biological evidence, and to apparently extend an operation that should have been over in a fraction of the time it actually took. The blood on the front porch is the forensic record of Nancy Guthrie's resistance, of an elderly woman refusing to be taken without a fight, of a moment of absolute terror met with absolute refusal to surrender. She fought those suspects in ways they had not prepared for, had not planned for, and frankly, by the standard of their tactical preparation, could not have managed effectively. Massey put it with the spare precision of someone who has spent a career understanding human behavior under extreme pressure. They were not prepared for the moment. They were not ready for what she gave them. This creates the paradox. And resolving the paradox is the key to understanding the full structure of this crime. On one side of the ledger, sophisticated planning. Reconnaissance visits to the property recorded by camera on January 11th and January 24th. Representing at least 3 weeks of deliberate preparation before the operation was executed. A coordinated two-person approach with divided roles and specific timing. Inside knowledge of the property layout, the camera positions, the entry points, the schedule, the security gate, the rear vulnerability that could not have been assembled through casual external observation. Technical capability to defeat multiple surveillance systems simultaneously using layered methods. An operation designed with the kind of detail that comes from someone who knew this target specifically and intimately. On the other side of the ledger, execution failures that belong to people who had never done this before. Amateur tactical choices at every level. Wrong equipment combinations. No preparation for victim resistance. 41 minutes on target when competent operatives would have been gone in under 10. There is only one coherent explanation for this combination. The person or people who designed this operation and the people who executed it were different individuals with different knowledge and different capabilities. Someone who had inside access, who understood the target property in detail, who could provide the operational intelligence necessary to plan an approach that actually worked, conceived this crime, and provided the blueprint for it. And people who had some capacity for coordination and logistics, but lacked any professional background in the specific skills that kidnapping operations require, were the ones who showed up at Camino Real at 1:32 in the morning to carry it out. Intelligence without competence. Detailed, specific, insider knowledge of the target, paired with execution by people who were prepared in general and unprepared in every particular. This is why it worked despite its failures. The planning was good enough to give them the information they needed. The execution was bad enough to leave evidence, to take 41 minutes, and to produce a forensic record that investigators are still processing. But the combination was sufficient because when you know which door is accessible, when you know the schedule, when you know the camera positions, when you have already defeated the neighborhood surveillance infrastructure before you arrive, you don't need to be a professional. You just need to be willing. Which brings us to the most disturbing question in this entire investigation. How did whoever planned this crime know what they knew? The FBI recovered surveillance thumbnails from cameras on Nancy's property in the days before she disappeared. According to reporting by ABC News, those thumbnails documented workers who had legitimate, regular access to the property. Landscapers, pool maintenance personnel, potentially others. All individuals with professional reasons to be on the grounds. All individuals whose presence would not have registered to Nancy or her neighbors as anything other than routine. Consider what that kind of access provides over time, accumulated through repeated legitimate visits. A landscaper who comes to Camino Real every 2 or 3 weeks has, over the course of months, observed which entry points are used most frequently, has seen which parts of the property are visible from the street and which are not, has worked in areas of the yard where the back of the house is fully accessible and the front entrance is out of sightline, has had ample opportunity to observe the security gate at the front door and make a professional assessment of its resistance to forced entry, has seen where cameras are mounted, the angles they cover, the portions of the property they do not cover, has noticed whether there are neighbors whose windows face the back of the property, has observed, over many visits, the patterns that define an elderly woman's daily life. When she is home, when she leaves, when deliveries arrive, when family members visit, the small rhythms that, taken together, constitute an operational profile. A pool technician working in the backyard has seen the rear access in direct, unmediated detail, has worked near whatever utility infrastructure exists at the back of the property, has had reason to be in areas that visitors using the front door never see, has accumulated, through the simple process of doing their job repeatedly over time, a familiarity with the property that most people who have never worked there could not replicate. None of this requires malicious intent at every level. Someone with access may have been recruited, may have been paid for information they provided without fully understanding what it would be used for, may have mentioned details in a conversation that they never expected to have operational consequences. Or, alternatively, someone with access may have known exactly what they were contributing to and made a deliberate choice. The forensic record does not yet allow us to determine which of these scenarios applies. What the forensic record does tell us is that the level of specific, granular knowledge embedded in the planning of this operation is inconsistent with external surveillance alone. You cannot determine from the street that the back entrance is more accessible than the front. You cannot assess the rear camera coverage from a passing vehicle. You cannot know the daily schedule of someone who lives quietly in a residential neighborhood by watching from a distance. That knowledge comes from inside the property, from direct, personal, repeated observation. The FBI's investigation has included intensive examination of everyone who had any form of access to the property in the period preceding the disappearance. Financial records, phone records, cell tower data showing which devices were present in the area at what times. Background investigations, interviews. The full weight of federal investigative resources applied to the question of who knew what about Camino Real and when they knew it. Now let us examine the surveillance defeat, because this dimension of the operation reveals something important about the technical capability involved in the planning. According to investigative reporting and statements from people in the surrounding neighborhood, FBI agents conducting their canvass after the disappearance asked residents a very specific question. Did your internet service go out on the night of February 1st? Do you have gaps in your security camera footage from those hours? Investigators do not ask that question during routine canvassing. They ask it when they have evidence-based reason to believe that internet connectivity in an area was intentionally disrupted. It is a targeted question with a specific informational objective. At least one neighbor reported that when they went back through their camera archive after the FBI inquiry, footage from those critical early morning hours was simply absent. A system that records continuously had no record of that specific time window. Additionally, a damaged utility box was discovered near Nancy's property, a piece of infrastructure that provides internet and telecommunications service to that section of the neighborhood. Chip Massey addressed the possibility of signal jamming directly. His analysis was nuanced in a way that adds to, rather than simplifies, the picture. If a broad-spectrum signal jammer was deployed, he asked, how does any doorbell footage exist at all? He is correct. A device that eliminates all wireless communication in an area would prevent cameras dependent on those signals from recording in the first place. Yet we have 15 minutes of clear footage from Nancy's front entrance before the camera was manually disabled. The reconciliation of this apparent contradiction points toward a layered surveillance defeat strategy rather than a single method. Physical damage to the utility box would have disrupted internet service for the neighborhood. disabling any camera that relied exclusively on cloud connectivity to store its recordings. Those cameras would appear to be functioning but would be recording to nothing, with any local buffer overwriting itself before it could be recovered. Nancy's doorbell camera appears to have had either sufficient local storage or a cellular backup transmission path that internet disruption could not defeat. That camera required individual physical attention, which is exactly what those 15 minutes document. A person standing at the camera interfering with its hardware, working to disable it at the specific moment that coordination with the rear entry demanded. The combination of neighborhood infrastructure disruption and individual camera defeat required prior knowledge. You have to know which cameras in the area use cloud storage exclusively. You have to know which one has a backup transmission path. You have to know that the utility box for that section of the neighborhood is at a specific location. You have to know the timing well enough to coordinate manual camera defeat with the progress of entry from the rear. This is sophisticated knowledge. Knowledge that belongs to someone who had thought through this operation at a level of technical detail that goes beyond what most people who decide to commit a crime ever engage with. And it sits in stark contradiction with thick gloves that make the holstered weapon unusable and no preparation for an 84-year-old woman's resistance. Different knowledge, different people. One plan, one crime. There is one additional element that merits examination, and it is the question that Laura, a neighbor who gave extended interviews in the weeks following the disappearance, kept returning to. Laura consulted a security professional specifically about the type of reinforced gate Nancy had installed at her front door. The assessment she received was unequivocal. You are not breaching that gate with improvised tools. You are not getting through it quietly. Any serious attempt to force it would require specialized equipment, significant time, and a level of noise that would travel through a residential neighborhood at 2 in the morning like an alarm. Investigators found no evidence of any attempt to force that gate. Not a scratch, not a dent, not a tool mark, nothing to indicate that anyone had touched it with hostile intent. Laura raised a possibility that investigators have not confirmed or denied publicly. If the suspects eventually needed to exit through the front of the house, perhaps because the vehicle was staged on the street side rather than the alley or rear access, someone had to open that gate from inside. And if it opened from inside without damage, it opened because someone with either a key or interior access to the lock mechanism operated it. Either a person already inside the house facilitated the exit, or the suspects, after entering from the rear and securing Nancy, had enough time during those 41 minutes to locate and use an interior release. The FBI has confirmed that Nancy's family members were investigated fully and cleared. They are victims. They are a family enduring what no family should endure: the sustained uncertainty of not knowing whether the person they love is alive and what condition she is in. Any analysis of this case that does not begin with that fact and return to it consistently is not a serious analysis. But the question of inside access does not require family involvement. The range of people who have had legitimate, unquestioned entry to a private residence over a period of time is broad. It includes everyone who came to provide a service, everyone who made a repair, everyone who had professional reason to be on the property. Any one of those individuals in any number of combinations could have contributed to the operational intelligence that made this crime possible. Where does this investigation stand now? The FBI's Phoenix field office has transitioned from the massive initial response, which involved dozens of agents working from Tucson in the days immediately following the disappearance, to the sustained, methodical work of the middle phase of a major kidnapping case. Agents travel from Phoenix to Tucson as operational needs require. Laboratory forensic work continues, including DNA analysis from biological material recovered at the scene, genetic genealogy processing that can potentially connect DNA to family lineages even without a direct database match, digital forensics on the camera systems, and analysis of cellular tower records covering the relevant geographic area during the relevant hours. Let us be specific about what that forensic work actually entails, because the public framing of an FBI investigation often obscures how painstaking and how time-consuming the science actually is. DNA analysis from a biological sample recovered at a crime scene is not a matter of running a test and getting a name. The sample has to be processed under strict chain-of-custody protocols that ensure the results will be admissible in court. The sample has to be sufficient in quality and quantity for meaningful analysis, which is not always the case with material recovered from an outdoor environment where weather, temperature, and contamination from other sources can degrade biological material. The resulting DNA profile has to be compared against available databases. If there is no direct database match, which is frequently the case when perpetrators have no prior criminal record that would have resulted in a DNA sample being taken and cataloged, investigators turn to genetic genealogy. This is the technique that has resolved numerous cold cases over the past decade, by comparing crime scene DNA to profiles in publicly accessible genealogy databases, identifying distant relatives, and then using traditional investigative methods to build a family tree that leads to the individual whose DNA matches the sample. It is powerful. It is also time-consuming in ways that are measured in weeks, not hours. Cellular tower analysis is similarly labor-intensive. Investigators can request records from telecommunications companies showing which devices connected to which towers in a specific geographic area during a specific time window. For the area around Camino Real between midnight and 3 in the morning on February 1st, that request would produce a list of every device that was in range, which in a residential neighborhood includes not only the people involved in the crime, but every sleeping resident whose phone was sitting on their nightstand, every neighbor whose devices connected to the nearest tower overnight. Investigators have to work through that data, cross-referencing device identifiers against known individuals, looking for devices that have no obvious reason to be in that area at that time, tracking movement patterns that correspond to what the timeline of the operation requires. Financial analysis covers every transaction associated with anyone identified as having had access to the property. This is not a simple review. It requires legal process to obtain banking and payment records. It requires analysis of transaction patterns, looking for cash withdrawals at unusual amounts or unusual times, for payments from sources that don't match a person's documented income, for transfers that correspond to the timing of the crime or the preparation for it, the kind of payment you might make to someone who provided useful information about a property, or the kind of payment a person might receive for doing a job they had never done before. Digital forensics on the camera infrastructure required by multiple accounts, assistance from engineers at Google, the company that owns the Nest camera platform. Recovering deleted or disrupted footage from modern camera systems is not a matter of restoring a file. It requires understanding the specific architecture of how that system stores data, how it manages the relationship between local storage and cloud backup, how disruption events are logged at the hardware level even when video recording has been interrupted, and what traces remain in the system's internal logs that might reveal information about what happened and when. The engineers who built those systems are the most qualified people to extract what remains. All of this takes time. All of it is happening. And all of it is moving toward a point at which the accumulated evidence either produces a name that investigators can act on or surfaces the human connection that breaks the case open from the inside. Steve Hooper, the former special agent in charge of the Phoenix field office, has described this phase of the investigation with the experience of someone who has seen cases like this move from initial response through the long, difficult middle passage to resolution. The breakthrough, he has said, most often comes not from a laboratory result, but from a person, an accomplice whose capacity to carry the weight of what they know erodes over time. A family member or associate who notices something that didn't register initially and suddenly understands what it means. An informant who calculates, correctly, that $1.2 million in cooperation credit from the federal government is a better outcome than whatever they are protecting with their silence. $1.2 million is not an abstract number. $1 million from Nancy's family, $100,000 from the FBI, $100,000 from an anonymous donor. That is enough money to fundamentally alter the trajectory of most people's lives. Enough to start over somewhere else. Enough to buy safety for someone who is afraid of what happens if they speak. Enough to justify the risk for someone who is weighing options. Savannah Guthrie's public messaging underwent a transition that those who study hostage negotiation and crisis communication recognized immediately as significant. The initial period of her public statements was directed at the people who had taken her mother. The language was calibrated to appeal to whatever human capacity for empathy or reconsideration might exist in the people she was addressing. It was designed to give them a psychological path, an emotional permission structure, to release Nancy voluntarily. That approach changed. The messaging shifted away from addressing the captors and toward addressing the public, asking for information, asking for anyone who knew anything to come forward. Chip Massey identified the shift and explained what it communicates in the language of hostage negotiation. It signals a breakdown in communication. It signals deadlines that passed without a response. It signals that proof of life was requested and not provided in a form that could be verified. Multiple communications claiming to demand ransom reached media organizations during the weeks following the disappearance. The figures varied in ways that are themselves telling. $6 million, $70,000, $50,000, 1 Bitcoin. No consistent demand, no consistent channel, no consistent entity. The FBI has stated that none of these communications could be verified as originating from anyone who demonstrably had Nancy. One individual, Derek Kayla from California, was arrested for sending a false ransom note. Investigators quickly established he had no connection to the actual crime. He was an opportunist, attempting to profit from a family's worst experience. The genuine perpetrators have maintained a silence that is either a deliberate operational choice or the result of a situation on the ground that has evolved in ways the investigation has not publicly disclosed. The forensic work continues. The cellular analysis continues. The financial transaction review continues. The interviews continue. The laboratory processing continues. Cases at this stage do not resolve quickly. They resolve when the accumulated weight of evidence reaches the point where someone cannot maintain their silence, or when a piece of forensic analysis produces a connection specific enough to justify an arrest. What this case needs, what it has needed since the first hours of February 1st, is a person. One person willing to step forward with the information that breaks it open. One person who decides that what they know is worth more disclosed than protected. If you were anywhere in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson between midnight and 3 in the morning on February 1st, 2026, and you saw anything that registered at the time as unusual, please contact the FBI. A vehicle that you did not recognize parked on a street it had no obvious reason to be on. Someone walking in an area where pedestrians are rare at that hour. Any movement, any light, any sound, any activity that caught your attention even for a moment before you decided it was probably nothing. Let investigators make that determination. The tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. If you have security camera footage from that night that you have not submitted to investigators, submit it now, even if you reviewed it yourself and saw nothing obviously relevant. Investigators have tools and training for extracting information from footage that most homeowners do not have. A vehicle in the background of an unrelated frame, a timestamp that establishes a pattern, a reflection, a shadow, something at the periphery of the frame that seems incidental but connects to something else. If you know someone whose behavior changed after February 1st, whose financial situation changed without explanation, who left Tucson suddenly or acted as though they needed to establish distance from something, who seemed to be carrying knowledge they were struggling to contain, say something. You are providing information to be evaluated, not making an accusation. And if you were involved in any capacity, if you provided information about the property, if you were hired to perform a role without fully understanding the operation you were contributing to, if you know the people who planned or executed this crime, your window to come forward on your own terms is closing. Investigations at this scale do not stop. They develop. They accumulate. One data point connects to another and to another until the pattern becomes undeniable and a name becomes inevitable. When investigators arrive at your door rather than you going to them, every option you currently have is gone. The cooperation credit, the potential for prosecutorial consideration, the chance to be the person who brought Nancy home, all of it exists only for the person who makes the call before the investigation makes it for them. Nancy Guthrie is a real person. She is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, a woman who built a genuine community around herself in a neighborhood in Tucson, who waved at her neighbors and sent Christmas cards and made the street feel like a place where people looked out for one another. She is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker and serious medical needs. She has been away from her medications, her monitoring equipment, and her physicians for weeks. Every day that passes is not just a day of fear and grief for her family. It is a day in which the medical risk to her life compounds in ways that are concrete and measurable. She fought the people who came for her. She left her blood on her own front porch as evidence of that fight. She did not go quietly. She gave investigators every piece of forensic material she could. Now it is time for the investigation to give her an answer. The FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Online tips can be submitted at tips.fbi.gov. The reward is $1.2 million. Nancy Guthrie has been missing since February 1st, 2026. Someone knows what happened. Someone knows where she is. That person needs to come forward. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, a case that still has answers waiting to be found. The search for truth continues. It does not stop until she comes home.